Today I'm going to show you how to make your favorite Photoshop sharpening tool a whole lot better. Hi, my name is Klaus Hermann and you can find me on farbspielfoto.com, where I show you how to create and craft better photos. Now, in today's tutorial, I'm going to show you a technique for making any sharpening tool that you may be using in Photoshop a whole lot better by separating the sharpening effect from the actual image pixels and putting it on its own layer. This allows you to change the image layer that is being sharpened and the sharpening effect at any time and independently. So it is completely non-destructive. This method is even more powerful and flexible than the recommended method of using smart objects and applying sharpening as a smart filter. There are obviously dozens of sharpening methods out there, including Photoshop's own range of filters and many plugin solutions. But what the overwhelming majority of these filters have in common is that you have to apply the sharpening effect to an actual image layer. The sharpening effect will be baked into the pixels of that layer. So this makes sharpening a destructive editing step, which limits the flexibility of your workflow quite a lot, as you cannot change the image pixels and the sharpening effect independently anymore. Now, there is one classical sharpening method that is based on a different approach, and that is Highpass Sharpening. Let me briefly show you how it is done before I tell you how you can apply the same principle to any other conceivable sharpening method. So I'm here in Photoshop with the sample image open as a background layer, and the first thing that we need to do in order to apply the Highpass Sharpening method is to select that layer and copy it by pressing Command or Control J. And let me just name this Highpass. And then with this Highpass layer selected, I'm going up here to the filter menu and I choose Other and Highpass. Now, when you tick the preview box up here, you can see that the image essentially turns gray and only the details and the edges in your image come through, and they're showing very faintly in this image. The only thing that you can do with the Highpass filter is to change the radius. So that's the amount of the details that you're adding to this gray image. And typically this radius should be somewhere between 1 and 10, which is very much depending on the nature of your image, on its size, and on the purpose for which you are creating it. For now, I think 4 is okay here, and I'm clicking OK. And that applies the filter to this layer. So basically we have a gray layer with a few details on it now, but that changes as soon as I go to the layer blend mode drop down up here and I choose overlay. And if I now turn off this layer and on again, you see that the image has been sharpened. Now let me zoom in here quite a lot and go to an area where you can actually see the sharpening. Now, if I turn the sharpening off, you can see that the image gets a lot softer than before. If I turn it on, those details that you've seen on the gray layer actually add to the image, and the overall effect is that we have a sharpened image. The great thing about this is that you can now change the sharpening effect and the image pixels separately. Both reside on different layers. So if I just turn off the sharpening layer, you can only see the background image without the sharpening. If I turn it back on, you have the sharpening, as I've shown you before, but you can also change the opacity to change or reduce that effect gradually. So if I go all the way down to 0, the effect is gone, and then I can gradually bring it back by raising the opacity again. That's awesome, because it allows you to change whatever is under that layer, that sharpening layer, and still have the sharpening applied to it. So it's completely non-destructive, and that's what you want for any kind of effect that you add to your images, obviously. But the downside is that the Highpass filter was not really created for the purpose of sharpening. So it is a very simple calculation that's actually applied to your image. And it has a few drawbacks, and it doesn't have a lot of the features that more advanced dedicated sharpening methods have. Now, for example, if you look at those walls here, you can see that you not only sharpen the details that you want to sharpen, so all the edges in your image, but you also sharpen the noise that you have in your image. So let me zoom in a bit closer here. If I turn the filter off, you can see there is noise, but not that much. And if I turn it back on, the noise is really strengthened and sharpened and comes out a lot more. Now, the other thing, as I said, is dedicated sharpening filters have a lot more controls and give you a lot more control over the way your image is sharpened. And that's what we're going to look at next. The filter that most people do use is Smart Sharpen, and it's arguably the most advanced and the best sharpening method inside Photoshop that you can use today. And to use that, I'm just going to disable this Highpass layer here, and let me just zoom out a little bit. And I'm again going to create a copy of my background layer. Let me call this Smart Sharpen. And in order to apply the filter, I'm again going to the filter menu, this time to Sharpen, and I choose Smart Sharpen here. That opens this little dialog box with a preview. And I'm not going to give you a full tour of this tool. That's beyond the scope of this tutorial. I'm just going to show you why this is better than the very simple Highpass sharpening method. So let me expand this below here, and the first thing that you see is that you have a lot more controls and a lot more control over your sharpening. Now we do have a radius, just like in the Highpass filter, and you can bring that up, and it generally serves the same purpose as in the Highpass filter scenario by giving you a way of controlling the size of the details that are going to be sharpened in your images. And then we have the amount. So based on a radius, you can raise or lower the amount of sharpening that you want to apply to those details. Another big thing here is the reduce noise slider, which lets you not only sharpen the details, but also decrease the sharpening on those areas that do not have any edges in them. So as you've seen on this wall before, the Highpass filter applied a lot of sharpening to that area. If we dial back the reduce noise slider to 0, you can see that we get a horrendous amount of noise here. And if we increase it to about 50, the noise is almost gone. So we've sharpened the edges, but we have not sharpened the noise, which is a great thing to have in a sharpening method. The other thing is that this filter lets you apply different amount of sharpening to the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. You can do this by using the shadows and highlights sections down here. And if you just look at this rock here, for example, and I increase the fade amount, you can see that there's not a lot of sharpening going on. If I dial that back down, the sharpening comes back in. So apart from applying a general type of sharpening to your image, you can control the sharpening in the highlights and the shadows separately. Now, I'm not going to optimize the settings for that particular image. That's not the purpose of this demonstration. I'm just going to apply those settings to this image layer. And Photoshop is going to take a few seconds to apply the effect. But then you can see that what actually happened is that the sharpening has been baked into the pixels of the image. Now that the Smart Sharpen filter has finished processing the image layer, you can see that when I turn it off, we have the original image below. When I turn the layer on, we have the sharpened layer. But contrary to the Highpass sharpening method, we now have the sharpening baked into the pixels. So we cannot change the sharpening and the image pixels separately, which is not a very good way to edit your images because it limits your flexibility a lot. So what I'm going to show you right now is how to put this Smart Sharpen effect or any kind of sharpening method, for that matter, onto a separate layer, just as we did with the Highpass filter. The first thing that you should do before you create the sharpening layer is to get rid of all the unwanted objects in your image. So if you want to do any cloning or healing, this is the time to do it, because later on, all those details will be in the sharpening layer. And if you remove any or add any details later on, you would have to redo the sharpening. Okay, in order to do this, I'm going to just turn off this Smart Sharpen layer that I've shown you before. I'm going to create another background layer, and I'm calling this simply Base. And now I'm zooming in, and I have a couple of spots in this image that I want to remove with the spot healing brush. One is a sensor dust spot up here, and I'm just brushing on it and let Photoshop remove it. And one is a bird down here. And then I think I've got a few things in the water here, this guy and this guy that I want to get rid of. And that's basically it. So I've now got a base layer to which we can apply the sharpening, which we then want to turn into a separate layer. The next step is to actually apply the sharpening to this base layer. Now you can apply any sharpening method that you want. I'm going to stick with Smart Sharpen because that's the most powerful that we have here in Photoshop. So I have this base layer and I'm going to make a copy of this by pressing Command or Control J. And I'm calling this Sharpen. And then I'm just doing the same thing as before. I'm going to the Sharpen menu here and I'm choosing Smart Sharpen. And I'm not bothering with these parameters. I'm just applying them for the purpose of this demonstration. Obviously, you should be optimizing those for the particular image. I just don't want to spend any time in this specific tutorial for doing this. Now that the sharpening has been applied to this layer, we need to find a way to get rid of all the image pixels and only retain the sharpening information on a separate layer, okay? And in order to do this, I'm going to make sure that the Sharpen layer is selected or active, and I'm zooming into the image so that you can see better what's going on here. And now I'm going to the Image menu and choose Apply Image. Now, Apply Image is one of those tools in Photoshop that is very intimidating to most people. And I'm not going to cover everything that's happening here. But just in a nutshell, what Apply Image does is it takes two layers and blends them using one of the available blend modes in Photoshop. So actually it's taking each pixel pair on the corresponding positions in each of the layers, and it applies some math to those pixels to come up with a new layer. That sounds very abstract, and it is very abstract until you have a concrete application, which I'm about to show you. So, the very first time that you open it, it's probably going to look something like this, but keep in mind that it remembers the settings, so it may look differently for you. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I am choosing a layer in this layer drop-down menu. Just take note that we have selected the Sharpen layer before we opened the tool, and I am going to pick the base layer here. So I am using the layer that we have applied the sharpening to. Okay, so base is the image pixels without the sharpening. Sharpen is the same image pixels with sharpening. The next thing that I'm doing is in the blending drop-down menu here, I am choosing subtract. Now, and suddenly the image starts looking funny. Everything's black except for those edges that we see. Now, and that looks suspiciously similar to the Highpass layer that we've seen before. What has happened is that Photoshop has taken pixel by pixel of those two layers and it has subtracted them. And since the Sharpen layer and the base layer are basically the same, except for those edges that we've sharpened, most of the pixels have a value of 0, which for Photoshop means black. So that's why most of those pixels are black. Only those pixels that have been changed by Smart Sharpen have a different value. They're either lighter or darker. Now, there are a couple of steps that we need to do in order to complete this. The first thing is to go to this offset field down here and type in 128. Now, this field basically takes tonal values. So 0 means black, 255 means white, and 128 is right in the middle. It's middle gray, 50% gray. And that means that we now see darker areas, which we haven't seen before when it was all black, and we see lighter areas just around those edges. And that's exactly the sharpening information that we need, okay? The final thing in this dialog is to put scale to 2. That's essentially a factor, a value by which Photoshop divides the result of this mathematical operation that it's going to apply. It's not that important, but just to make sure that the combination of those two layers looks exactly like the original layer or the sharpened layer, we have to put a value of 2 in this field. And now I'm going to click OK. And we have a very similar looking layer to the one that the Highpass filter gave us. And what we do next is go to the blend mode dialog, drop down up here and choose linear light. Now, and I have the original Sharpen layer up here, and if I turn that on, you can see that the image is exactly the same. So basically the combination of those two layers here, Sharpen and Base, gives us the same image, the same pixels as the Sharpen layer, as the Smart Sharpen layer, to which we applied the Smart Sharpen filter before. And that's exactly what we want, because now I can turn off this Sharpen layer and the sharpening effect is gone. If I turn it back on, I have the Sharpen effect, and I can lower the opacity, for example, to reduce the effect, or I can copy the layer to have a stronger effect. That's exactly what we tried to achieve. We now have the Smart Sharpen effect on a separate layer. What you can now do, for example, is to add a black and white layer to the base layer. Okay, so let me just get rid of those two guys here because we don't need them anymore. And we can now edit those image pixels in the base layer separately from the Sharpen pixels. That's what we wanted to achieve. And for example, let me just create a black and white adjustment layer here, and let's make those yellows very dark and the blues very bright. And you can see we still have the same sharpening effect. So the sharpening also applies to that adjustment layer and everything that's below it. Okay. Another example, let me just duplicate this and apply a more complex filter. I'm going to apply a run of Topaz Adjust 5 here. Let me just pick a random filter here and apply that. And that filter actually changes the pixels of that layer, which is exactly the case why we need non-destructive sharpening, as I've shown it to you. So you can see that this Topaz Adjust 5 filter now changes the colors and the lighting and the exposure of this layer, but we still have the same sharpening effect, and we can turn it on and off at any time, lower the opacity, totally independent of what happens below in the layer stack. Now it is important to understand that this is not limited to the Smart Sharpen filter only. You can apply any kind of sharpening tool that is available to you in Photoshop, apply it to an image layer, and then create a sharpening layer from that. So let me just show you how you do that. It's the same principle as before. I'm going to copy that layer, and now I am applying another filter, which is Topaz in Focus, a very sophisticated sharpening tool by Topaz Labs. I'm just going to dial in some parameters here without paying too much attention to what the image actually does. So you can see when I toggle the before and after, there is a sharpening applied to the image. I'm going to have Topaz in Focus apply that to our image layer, and then we're going to turn that image layer into a sharpening layer as well. So In Focus has finished processing the image, and let me just turn off these guys here. And you can see it's a different kind of sharpening method, and it produces a lot of noise, but still we see the sharpening effect. And now we can do the very same thing as we did before. I make sure that this sharpened layer is selected. I go to Image, Apply Image. The settings have been remembered, so I don't need to do anything here. I press OK. I turn this to linear light, and we have a second sharpening layer with another sharpening method. And we can switch between those two if we like, or we can add them and have them active both at the same time. Now you could argue that the same can be achieved using smart objects and applying my sharpening tool as a smart filter. And that is true in a certain sense, but let me show you the difference between those two approaches. Now let me just create another copy of my base layer here. I'm just moving that to the top of the stack, and let me convert this to a smart object. Okay, so a smart object lets you edit the contents of that object, and it lets you apply filters as smart filters so that you can change them after you have applied them, which is basically what we wanted to achieve for the most part. Now that Photoshop has completed converting our layer to a smart object, I can again go to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen, and apply that filter. It's going to take a few seconds, but then you can see that Photoshop has applied that filter and I can do special things with it. Once Smart Sharpen has finished, you can see that we have the Smart Filters section down here with a separate mask which applies to all the filters below. And the Smart Sharpen filter is here with the eye icon before it. So I could click on that eye icon to turn off the effect, and then I could turn it on again. Now, please note that every time I do this, Smart Sharpen has to run again and reapply the filter to that layer. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that still that Smart Sharpen is attached to a pixel layer. So as long as you have a single pixel layer in your project, that's probably going to work to some extent. But as soon as you have a second pixel layer, for example, if I were to take my Topaz Adjust layer from before, and if I wanted to just apply that effect to the sky, let me make a quick selection here and apply a layer mask. Now in that case, I would have a problem because the Smart Sharpen filter is only applying to the space copy layer here and not to the layer above. So what I could now do is merge those two, convert it into a smart object again, and apply another Smart Sharpen filter to it. But that's all very clunky and not very convenient. And with the solution that I've shown you, you have got a sharpening layer that you can just put on top of your layer stack, and it's going to affect everything below it. And you only have to renew that layer once you change some details in your image, okay? So that's the great advantage of this method that I've just shown you in this tutorial. In this tutorial, I've shown you how to use any sharpening method available in Photoshop or via a plugin and put its sharpening effect onto a separate layer that blends with the layers below. This renders your sharpening non-destructive and gives you a ton of flexibility. We created a copy of the image layer and applied the sharpening tool, which happened to be the Smart Sharpen filter, to this layer. Then we used the Apply Image command to subtract the original image pixels from the sharpened layer and change its blend mode to linear light. The result is a sharpening effect created by your favorite sharpening tool placed on a separate layer that you can now turn on or off and change in strength at any time. As long as you do not add or remove elements in your image, you can also change the underlying image pixels without restrictions. If you want more tutorials like this, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and sign up for our newsletter to get the latest and greatest Photoshop, Lightroom and photography tutorials straight to your inbox. That's all from me for today. See you next time and keep creating.